They thought they could silence him. The HOA believed their rules were untouchable, their threats unquestioned, and their power absolute. But when they tried to strip away his voice, they unknowingly set into motion a battle they could never win. What began as a simple letter quickly spiraled into fines, intimidation, and a campaign to break him down. Yet, hidden behind his quiet, determination was a weapon far stronger than their control, the law itself. How far would the HOA go to keep him silent? And what would happen when their own tactics turned against them? In the quiet folds of a gated community, where every lawn seemed measured with a ruler, and every fence matched, the shade of the neighbors, lived Daniel Harper. He wasn't the type to stir trouble. A man in his early 40s, he worked long hours at a local firm and cherished the rare evenings he could spend with his wife and daughter under the warm glow of their porch light. Their home wasn't extravagant, but it carried a sense of pride. Flower beds planted by his daughter's hands, a modest flag swaying in the breeze, and a sense of comfort that came from years of careful effort. Neighbors often passed with polite nods, the kind that said just enough but revealed little more. On weekends, the cul-de-sac filled with children riding bikes, sprinklers misting the air, and the faint hum of lawnmowers trimming what felt like identical patches of grass. From a distance it looked picture-perfect, like a neighborhood frozen in a postcard. But underneath that polished surface ran an undercurrent of control, an invisible leash, pulled by the Homeowners Association. Residents knew the HOA had rules. Some were sensible, keeping sidewalks clear, repairing broken shutters, but others felt like invisible chains, rules that dictated the color of your curtains, the height of your grass, even the type of holiday lights you could hang. Daniel had heard murmurs from neighbors, quiet complaints at backyard barbecues, or whispered warnings at the mailbox. Most brushed it off, choosing to stay quiet rather than risk drawing attention. For years, Daniel kept his head down, believing that as long as he followed the rules, trouble would never reach his doorstep. But that peace was fragile, balanced on the whims of a board that thrived on power. And while he lived unaware, something small, a decision most wouldn't even notice, was about to ignite a conflict that would test every boundary of freedom, patience, and law. Because in this neighborhood, silence was expected, and Daniel, without realizing it yet, was about to break that silence. It began with a letter, folded neatly, tucked into an envelope with the HOA's emblem across the top. It sat waiting in Daniel Harper's mailbox. At first, he thought little of it. HOA notices weren't unusual. Reminders about dues, neighborhood events, or seasonal guidelines. But when he opened this one, the tone felt different. It wasn't a reminder. It was a warning. According to the board, Daniel's small American flag, fixed on a modest wooden post by his porch, was non-compliant. The letter stated that flags of any kind required prior approval, and because his hadn't been submitted for review, he was in violation. If he didn't remove it within 10 days, fines would begin to accrue. $50 a day, compounding until the matter was resolved. Daniel stared at the page in disbelief. The flag wasn't oversized, wasn't obstructing anyone's view, and certainly wasn't harming the pristine image of the neighborhood. It was the kind of flag you'd see in countless yards across America. He crumpled the paper in his fist, thinking it must have been some mistake. But as the days ticked on, more letters followed, each one harsher, each one piling on threats of escalating fines and legal action if he didn't comply. He decided to attend the next HOA board meeting to address it face-to-face. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a pristine building with perfectly polished floors and sterile decor that matched the neighborhood's obsession with uniformity. Inside, the board sat at a long table, papers neatly stacked, gavel at the ready. At the center sat Elaine Marsh, the HOA president, a woman known for her sharp eyes and sharper tongue. Daniel presented his case calmly at first, explaining that the flag was modest, respectful, and well within reason. But before he could finish, Elaine cut him off. "Rules are rules, Mr. Harper. If we allow one exception, chaos follows." Her words were followed by murmurs of agreement from a few board members. He left that meeting with nothing but frustration. It became clear that this wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control, and Daniel had unknowingly painted a target on his back. The fines began almost immediately. First $50, then $100, and then $250. Each notice arrived with the same cold phrasing, signed off by the board, as if they were passing judgment from a bench. When he called to dispute the charges, his calls went unanswered. When he emailed, the replies were short, clipped, and dismissive. Soon, other issues began to pile up. The board claimed his grass was half an inch too long and issued a citation. A holiday wreath placed on his door was unapproved decor. His daughter's chalk drawings on the driveway were labelled graffiti. One by one, the board weaponized every rule, every line of the HOA covenant against him. Neighbors began to notice. Some whispered words of sympathy, but most kept their distance, unwilling to invite trouble to their own doors. The Harpers' once peaceful evenings grew heavy with tension. Daniel's wife worried about the mounting fines, while his daughter asked why they couldn't just take the flag down. But to Daniel, this had gone beyond a simple decoration. It was about principle, about standing up to a system that thrived on intimidation. Then came the knock on the door. Late one evening, as Daniel sat at the kitchen table reviewing another stack of violation notices, two men in plain suits appeared. They introduced themselves as compliance officers for the HOA, demanding access to his backyard to inspect possible violations. Their tone was firm, almost rehearsed, and when Daniel refused, they threatened legal consequences. He closed the door on them, his hands trembling, not from fear, but from anger. Word spread quickly. Some neighbors whispered that Daniel was becoming difficult. Others admired his resolve, but kept their support hidden. The board, however, grew bolder. They posted a notice on the community bulletin board stating that Daniel Harper was in violation of multiple covenants and subject to escalating enforcement measures. To the casual passerby, it looked like a public shaming. By now, the fines had crossed several $1,000s. Threats of liens on his property arrived in thick envelopes stamped urgent, and still the board refused to budge. Every attempt to reason, every request for fairness, was met with the same iron wall. Rules are rules. The tension reached its breaking point when Daniel received a certified letter. The HOA intended to pursue legal action, and if unpaid, they could move to foreclose on his home. It was no longer just about the flag, the grass, or the chalk drawings. They were threatening to take the very roof from over his family's head. That night, Daniel sat in silence on his porch, the flag gently swaying above him. His wife joined him, her face lined with worry. The neighborhood around them was quiet, almost mocking in its perfection. And in that silence, Daniel made a decision. If the HOA wanted to test his resolve, they would learn he wasn't a man who bowed easily. He would not just defend himself, he would fight back, using the very laws they thought gave them power. But as he began gathering evidence, letters, photos, records of their harassment, he discovered something unexpected. Buried in the HOA's bylaws and state statutes were cracks in their foundation, contradictions they had ignored for years. The same rules they used to control the neighborhood had limits, and the same law they threatened him with could, if wielded correctly, dismantle their authority. The Harpers' quiet life had been shattered, but Daniel wasn't the same man who once believed following the rules would keep him safe. Now he carried a purpose, fueled by anger and sharpened by determination. The battle had escalated beyond petty fines and violations. It was a war for freedom, dignity, and the right to stand on his own land without bowing to an overreaching board. The HOA thought they had cornered him, but Daniel was just getting started. The battle lines had been drawn, and the HOA believed they were closing in for the final strike. Letters stamped with red ink poured into Daniel Harper's mailbox, each one more aggressive than the last. The threat of foreclosure loomed like a storm cloud, dark and suffocating. The board was confident. They had seen countless residents buckle under this pressure, forced to either pay up or leave quietly. But Daniel was not like the others. Night after night he sat at his dining room table surrounded by papers. HOA bylaws, state property statutes, and precedent cases from court records. He read until his eyes blurred, cross-referencing every word of the covenants the board loved to quote. And that's when the truth revealed itself like a hidden key. The board had been bluffing. Their authority wasn't absolute. State law placed strict limits on what they could fine, how they could enforce liens, and even what restrictions they could impose on flags and decorations. The very flag they had attacked was protected under state statute. The fines they had stacked against him exceeded legal caps, and their threats of foreclosure empty. They had no power to seize his property over manufactured violations. Daniel realized something chilling. This wasn't just negligence, it was willful abuse. The HOA was banking on his ignorance. They had expected him to cave. Instead, he was about to turn the tables in a way they never saw coming. He filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office, attaching every letter, every threat, and every photograph of the violations. He sent a detailed packet to a local news outlet known for exposing corruption, and he prepared his case for the upcoming HOA meeting, where the board had promised to review his compliance one final time. The night of that meeting, the air was thick with anticipation. The clubhouse parking lot was full. Word had spread about the ongoing war between Daniel Harper and the HOA. Curious neighbors filed inside, whispering among themselves, wondering if this would be the night the board finally broke him. Inside, the board sat in their usual rigid formation, led by Elaine Marsh at the center. She wore a satisfied smile, certain this meeting would end in Daniel's humiliation. A large folder sat in front of her, no doubt the stack of violations they intended to parade against him. When Daniel's name was called, he rose slowly and walked to the front. The room fell silent. He carried with him a single binder, thick with documents neatly tabbed and organized. But he did not open it immediately. Instead, he began with his story, calmly, clearly, and without hesitation. He recounted the first violation letter about the flag, the fines that piled up day after day, the inspections without consent, the harassment disguised as compliance checks. He described how his daughter's chalk drawings had been labeled graffiti, how a simple wreath had been declared illegal, how every rule had been twisted into a weapon against his family. His voice didn't shake. It rang with controlled fury, each word striking the board like a hammer. Then he opened the binder. Inside were copies of state statutes, the ones that guaranteed his right to fly the flag without HOA interference. He pointed to the exact lines that nullified their claims. Next, he revealed the cap on fines under state law, showing how the board had grossly exceeded their legal authority. And finally, he presented correspondence from the State Attorney General's office, confirming that his complaint had been received and was under review for possible legal action against the board. Gasps echoed through the room. Neighbors leaned forward, wide-eyed, as Daniel laid bare the truth. The HOA wasn't enforcing rules. They were abusing power. Elaine Marsh tried to interject, her voice sharp, but Daniel was ready. He held up a letter, one signed by her personally, threatening foreclosure. Then he read aloud the statute that proved the threat was not only invalid but potentially illegal. Whispers rippled through the crowd, louder this time, tinged with anger. The board shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For years, they had ruled with an iron fist, silencing anyone who dared to resist. But in that moment, their authority began to crumble under the weight of cold, undeniable facts. Then came the final blow. Daniel revealed the letter from the local news station. They were investigating the HOA for overreach, and if the board continued their campaign against him, their actions would not only be reviewed by the attorney general, but broadcast for the entire community and beyond to see. The room erupted. Neighbors who had remained silent out of fear now found their voices. Some shouted in anger, demanding explanations. Others cheered Daniel for standing his ground. Years of quiet frustration bubbled to the surface, and suddenly, Elaine Marsh and her board weren't in control anymore. They were trapped, exposed, and publicly humiliated. Elaine tried to gavel the room back to order, her face flushed with panic. But it was too late. The people she once controlled had seen the truth, and Daniel, standing tall in the center of the chaos, became the symbol of resistance they hadn't realized they needed. The climax reached its peak when Daniel delivered his final words. "You tried to take my home. You tried to silence me, but the law doesn't belong to you. It belongs to all of us. And tonight your reign of fear ends." Silence followed, a heavy, charged silence that spoke louder than any applause. For the first time, the board looked small, powerless, and afraid. As Daniel left the clubhouse that night, neighbors approached him one by one, shaking his hand, thanking him, some even apologizing for staying silent before. He walked out into the cool night air, the flag at his porch visible in the distance, fluttering gently as if in victory. But while the battle inside the clubhouse was won, the war wasn't over. The Attorney General's investigation was still ongoing. The board might try one last desperate move, and the cracks in their power, though now exposed, still ran deep through the community. Daniel knew one thing for certain. The HOA had underestimated him, and that mistake would cost them everything. The morning after the explosive HOA meeting, the entire neighborhood felt different. Where once silence had reigned, whispers now spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had quietly endured fines and harassment finally allowed themselves to talk openly. Doorstep conversations lasted longer. People exchanged stories they had once buried out of fear, each one echoing the same truth. They had all been victims of the board's abuse, and Daniel Harper's stand had exposed it. But for Daniel, the fight was not finished. That very week, the State Attorney General's office reached out again. They had reviewed his packet in detail, and now they wanted to interview him further. They asked for testimony, timelines, and a full account of the HOA's overreach. The letter was firm but reassuring. The allegations were being taken seriously. The board, once so bold in their intimidation, suddenly grew quiet. Weeks passed, and not a single violation notice arrived at Daniel's door. The red-stamped letters that once poured in like a tide had stopped entirely. Instead, the HOA shifted to damage control. Elaine Marsh, the president who had ruled with an iron fist, began circulating cheerful newsletters about community unity and transparency, hoping to calm the storm. But it was too late. The neighbors had seen too much. They had witnessed the threats, the humiliation, and then the exposure of lies. They no longer viewed the board as enforcers of order. They saw them as manipulators clinging to crumbling power. In the months that followed, a petition circulated quietly through the community, one that called for the removal of Elaine and several other board members. Where once such an idea would have been unthinkable, signatures now appeared with startling speed. Families who had never spoken up before eagerly added their names, fueled by years of pent-up resentment. By the time the next election rolled around, the board that had once ruled unchallenged was gone, voted out in a landslide. Elaine herself disappeared almost overnight. One day she was storming through lawns, barking orders and scribbling violations. The next, her house stood empty, blinds drawn, car gone. Some whispered that she had moved to another HOA community, hoping to start fresh. Others believed the ongoing investigation had made her position untenable. Whatever the truth, she never returned. Daniel, meanwhile, became something unexpected, a symbol of resistance, not just in his own neighborhood, but beyond. When the local news station finally aired their segment, his story captured widespread attention. They titled it "Homeowner Fights Back: How One Man Took on His HOA and Won." Viewers across the city, and even across the state, watched as Daniel's binder of evidence, his steady voice, and his refusal to be silenced turned into a rallying cry. The response was overwhelming. Letters arrived at his door from strangers who had seen the broadcast, each one thanking him for standing up, some even asking for advice on how to fight their own battles. People he had never met called him brave, though he insisted he had simply done what anyone should do when threatened. But deep down, he knew that most people never found the courage. That was the real tragedy, that so many had been crushed under the weight of silence. In his own neighborhood, life slowly returned to normal. Children played in the streets without fear of their chalk being declared vandalism. Families decorated their homes for holidays without receiving warnings. The flag that had once sparked war continued to wave proudly in Daniel's yard, untouched and unchallenged. But there was more. The state's investigation did not fade quietly into paperwork. Months later, a formal notice was issued. The HOA board's conduct had violated state statutes. They were fined heavily, ordered to revise their enforcement policies, and mandated to undergo compliance training. The ruling sent shockwaves through HOA circles across the state, serving as a clear warning that overreach would not be tolerated. For Daniel, it was vindication. The very people who had once threatened to take his home now stood branded as lawbreakers. They had lost not only their power, but their reputation, and the ripple effect stretched far beyond one cul-de-sac. Other HOAs, wary of facing the same fate, began softening their grip, loosening their rules, and treating residents with more caution. It was not just Daniel's victory. It was a victory for countless others who had suffered silently under the weight of petty authoritarianism. Years later, the story of the HOA war was still told in that community. New residents heard whispers about the battle at the clubhouse, about the man who stood against the board and brought the law crashing down upon them. Children who had once been told to erase their chalk drawings now grew up believing that rules should be fair, not fear-driven. The neighborhood was no longer defined by hostility, but by the memory of how it had been reclaimed. Daniel himself never sought power on the board, despite many urging him to run. He believed he had fought his fight and earned his peace. Instead, he lived quietly, his porch light glowing warmly in the evening, his flag fluttering freely above his yard. He had no desire to rule. His only desire had been to live without harassment, and in that he had succeeded. But his legacy remained. To those who lived there, he became the quiet proof that one person could change everything. That when power grows unchecked, it takes only a single act of courage to shatter it. And perhaps that is the true impact of his story. Not the fines overturned, not the board dismantled, not even the state investigation. The real victory was the awakening of ordinary people, neighbors who realized they did not have to live in fear, that they had a voice, and that the law, when used wisely, could be stronger than intimidation. In the end, the HOA tried to silence Daniel Harper. They tried to bury him under fines, strip him of his dignity, and scare him into submission. But instead, they revealed their own weakness. They exposed the truth that bullies, no matter how official they appear, are only as powerful as the silence of those around them. And so the story closed where it had begun, with a man, his home, and a flag fluttering in the wind. A simple symbol, once attacked, now untouchable. Because sometimes the most ordinary things, chalk on a sidewalk, a wreath on a door, a flag in a yard, become the battlegrounds where freedom is tested. And sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to bend to remind everyone else that the law was never meant to silence them. It was meant to protect them. So the next time a board or a bully tries to overreach, perhaps the question will linger in the minds of those who hear this tale: if Daniel Harper could stand against them and win, what's stopping me?